The Scream Next Door. Chapter 1: A Quiet Night Shattered. Sarah Miller had always been a light sleeper. It was both a blessing and a curse, allowing her to wake up easily for early morning shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, but also making it difficult to get a full night's rest in her bustling apartment complex. On this particular Wednesday night in late August, Sarah had just drifted off into a light slumber when a piercing scream shattered the quiet of the night. Her eyes flew open, heart pounding in her chest as she sat bolt upright in bed. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it, a remnant of a nightmare, perhaps. But then it came again, a blood-curdling shriek that seemed to reverberate through the walls of her small apartment. Without hesitation, Sarah threw off her covers and stumbled to her feet. The scream had come from next door, she was certain of it. Mrs. Abernathy lived there, a kindly widow in her 70s who often invited Sarah over for tea and homemade cookies. The thought of something happening to the sweet old lady sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Grabbing her phone and slipping on a pair of shoes, Sarah rushed out of her apartment and into the dimly lit hallway. She paused for a moment outside Mrs. Abernathy's door, listening intently. The silence that followed the scream was almost more unnerving than the sound itself. "Mrs. Abernathy?" Sarah called out, knocking firmly on the door. "Are you all right?" "It's Sarah from next door." No response came. Sarah's concern deepened as she noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. Mrs. Abernathy was usually quite security conscious, always double-checking that her door was locked. With a growing sense of unease, Sarah pushed the door open wider. "Hello? Mrs. Abernathy?" She called out again, stepping cautiously into the apartment. The living room was dark and still, illuminated only by the faint glow of a nightlight plugged into the wall. Sarah fumbled for the light switch, and as the room flooded with light, she gasped. The usually tidy space was in disarray. A vase lay shattered on the floor, water and flowers scattered across the carpet. Picture frames hung crookedly on the walls, and a chair was overturned near the coffee table. "Oh my God!" Sarah whispered, her mind racing. Had there been a break-in? Was Mrs. Abernathy hurt? Or worse? She moved quickly through the apartment, checking each room, her heart pounding louder with each empty space she encountered. The bedroom was untouched, the bed still neatly made. The bathroom was empty, towels hanging undisturbed on their racks. The small study at the back of the apartment showed no signs of disturbance. Sarah returned to the living room, confusion and fear warring within her. Mrs. Abernathy was nowhere to be found, but her purse and keys still sat on the small table by the door. Where could she have gone? And what had caused that terrifying scream? As Sarah stood in the middle of the disheveled living room, trying to make sense of the situation, she noticed something she had overlooked before. On the coffee table, partially hidden by a fallen stack of magazines, was a single sheet of paper. Sarah approached cautiously, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she pulled a tissue from her pocket to pick up the paper without touching it directly. In shaky handwriting, barely legible, were 4 words that made Sarah's blood run cold. "They found me. Help." Chapter 2: The Investigation Begins. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the cryptic message. Who were they? And how could Mrs. Abernathy have disappeared so quickly and completely? The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped Sarah out of her daze. She quickly pulled out her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice came through the speaker. "I need to report a missing person and possible break-in," Sarah stammered, her eyes darting around the room. "My neighbor. I heard her scream, and now she's gone. Her apartment's a mess, and there's a note." The dispatcher asked for more details, which Sarah provided as best she could. Within minutes, the sound of sirens could be heard approaching the apartment complex. Sarah waited anxiously, pacing back and forth in the living room, careful not to disturb anything that might be evidence. Two police officers arrived shortly after, introducing themselves as Officer Chen and Officer Rodriguez. They listened intently as Sarah recounted the events of the night, from the scream that woke her to the discovery of the empty apartment and the mysterious note. "And you're certain you heard a scream?" Officer Chen asked, jotting notes in a small pad. Sarah nodded emphatically. "Yes, absolutely. It woke me up, and then I heard it again." Officer Rodriguez was examining the overturned furniture and the shattered vase. "Looks like there was some kind of struggle," he observed. "Ms. Miller, did Mrs. Abernathy have any enemies that you know of? Anyone who might want to harm her?" Sarah shook her head, bewildered. "No, not at all. She's the sweetest person. Everyone in the building loves her. She bakes cookies for the kids and helps water people's plants when they're away. I can't imagine anyone wanting to hurt her." The officers exchanged a glance. "We're going to need to take a closer look around," Officer Chen said. "Ms. Miller, we appreciate your help, but we'll need you to step outside now. We'll have some more questions for you in a bit." Reluctantly, Sarah left the apartment, her mind whirling with possibilities. "Sarah, what's happening?" he asked, his voice hushed. "Is Mrs. Abernathy okay?" Sarah hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I heard a scream, and when I came to check, she was gone." Mrs. Abernathy was well liked in the building, and the idea that something might have happened to her was deeply unsettling. As Sarah fielded questions from her worried neighbors, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. The note kept replaying in her mind. "They found me. Help." What did it mean? And why did Mrs. Abernathy feel the need to write it instead of calling for help? "We have a few more questions." Sarah followed the officer back into Mrs. Abernathy's apartment. The living room had been cordoned off with yellow police tape, and she could see evidence markers placed around the room. Officer Rodriguez was speaking quietly into his radio in the corner. "Ms. Miller," Officer Chen began, "we've done a preliminary search of the apartment, and found no signs of forced entry. The windows are all locked from the inside, and there's no evidence of anyone leaving through them. Can you think of anyone who might have had a key to Mrs. Abernathy's apartment?" "Well, the building manager would have a master key. And I know Mrs. Abernathy's daughter has a spare, but she lives in California. Oh, and..." She paused, remembering something. "He comes to visit sometimes, helps her with errands and things like that." "Do you know this nephew's name or how we might contact him?" "I'm sorry I don't," Sarah replied, feeling frustrated with her lack of useful information. "I've never met him. I just know he exists because Mrs. Abernathy has mentioned him a few times." As the officer continued to ask questions, Sarah's eyes wandered around the room, taking in details she hadn't noticed before. A framed photo on the mantel caught her attention. It showed a younger Mrs. Abernathy standing next to a man who looked to be in his 30s. They were both smiling, and the man had his arm around Mrs. Abernathy's shoulders. "Is that her nephew?" Sarah asked, pointing to the photo. Officer Chen walked over to examine it. "Could be. We'll need to get this to the station for further analysis. Ms. Miller, is there anything else you can tell us about Mrs. Abernathy? Any unusual behavior lately, or people she might have been afraid of?" "No, nothing like that. She's been her usual cheerful self. We had tea together just yesterday afternoon, and everything seemed normal." As Sarah spoke, a memory suddenly surfaced. "Wait," she said. "There was one thing. It didn't seem important at the time, but yesterday, when I was leaving her apartment, Mrs. Abernathy said something odd. She said, 'Sarah, dear, if anything ever happens to me, remember the blue book.' I thought she was just being morbid. You know how older people can be sometimes, thinking about their mortality." Officer Chen's eyebrows raised. "The blue book? Did she elaborate on what she meant?" "That's all she said. I didn't think to ask what she meant. The officer made another note. All right, Ms. Miller. We're going to need you to come down to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. For now, try to get some rest. We'll be in touch if we need any more information. As Sarah left the apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just become entangled in something far more complex and dangerous than she could have imagined. Whatever had happened to her kindly neighbor, Sarah was determined to find out the truth. Little did she know, her quest for answers would lead her down a path fraught with danger, secrets, and a conspiracy that stretched back decades. Chapter 3: The Blue Book Mystery. Sleep eluded Sarah for the rest of the night. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with possibilities and questions. As the first light of dawn began to filter through her curtains, she gave up on the idea of rest and decided to take action. Mrs. Abernathy's words about the blue book nagged at her. It had to be significant. Why else would the old woman have mentioned it so cryptically? Sarah knew she shouldn't interfere with the police investigation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time was of the essence. If that blue book held any clues to Mrs. Abernathy's disappearance, Sarah needed to find it before anyone else did. The police tape across Mrs. Abernathy's door gave her pause, but only for a moment. Taking a deep breath, she ducked under it and entered the apartment. The living room looked even more eerie in the dim morning light. Sarah moved quickly, her eyes scanning the bookshelves that lined one wall of the room. There were dozens of books, their spines a rainbow of colors, but none that stood out as particularly blue. She moved to the study, her heart pounding with the fear of being discovered. The small room was lined with more bookshelves, and a sturdy oak desk dominated the center. Sarah's eyes darted from shelf to shelf, searching for anything that might be the book Mrs. Abernathy had referred to. Just as she was about to give up, a glint of blue caught her eye. It wasn't a book on the shelves, but a small, blue leather-bound journal tucked into the bottom drawer of the desk. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled it out. A small brass lock held it shut, but the key was missing. Sarah bit her lip, conflicted. She knew she shouldn't be here, shouldn't be touching potential evidence. The journal fell open, revealing pages filled with neat, cramped handwriting. As Sarah began to read, her eyes widened in shock. The first few pages seemed innocuous enough: daily observations, notes about the weather, and personal reflections. But as Sarah flipped through the pages, the entries took on a more serious tone. April 15, 1965, another meeting today. Jay says the information is more valuable than we realized. God help us if anyone ever finds out. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the pages. What kind of information was Mrs. Abernathy talking about? And who was Jay? As she continued to read, a picture began to emerge, one of secret meetings, coded messages, and a conspiracy that seemed to involve high-ranking government officials. Mrs. Abernathy, it seemed, had been involved in something far bigger and more dangerous than Sarah could have imagined. The sound of a key in the lock of the apartment door jolted Sarah back to reality. Panic surged through her as she realized someone was entering the apartment. The study had no closet, and the desk was too small to conceal her. In desperation, Sarah dove behind a large armchair in the corner, trying to make herself as small as possible. The door to the apartment opened, and Sarah held her breath. Footsteps moved across the living room, slow and deliberate. They paused for a moment, then continued towards the study. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as the study door creaked open. From her hiding spot, she could see a pair of men's shoes enter the room. They moved directly to the desk, and Sarah heard the sound of drawers being opened and closed. The old lady must have moved it. Another voice, this one smoother and calmer, replied, "Keep looking. We can't afford for that journal to fall into the wrong hands." Sarah's blood ran cold. The journal. They were looking for the very thing she had just taken. She clutched her bag tighter, praying they wouldn't think to look behind the armchair. The search continued for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Sarah remained frozen in her hiding spot, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, the gruff voice spoke again. "It's not here, boss." "What do we do now?" There was a pause, and Sarah could almost feel the tension in the air. "She couldn't have gone far. And when we find her, we'll get that journal. One way or another." She waited several long minutes, her body aching from the cramped position, before she dared to move. The apartment was silent once more, but it no longer felt empty. The presence of the two men, whoever they were, lingered like a dark cloud. Sarah knew she should call the police, tell them about the intruders and the journal. But something held her back. The men had been looking for the journal, which meant they knew about its contents. If they had connections to the government, as Mrs. Abernathy's writings suggested, how could Sarah be sure the police weren't involved? With a sinking feeling, Sarah realized she was now in possession of something incredibly dangerous. Whatever secrets the blue journal held, there were people willing to go to great lengths to obtain them. As she slipped out of the apartment and back to her own, Sarah's mind raced. She had wanted to help Mrs. Abernathy, to solve the mystery of her disappearance. Instead, she had stumbled into a web of secrets and lies that stretched back decades. One thing was clear: finding Mrs. Abernathy was more crucial than ever. And to do that, Sarah would need to unravel the mystery of the blue journal, before those who were searching for it caught up with her. Sarah spent the next few hours poring over the contents of the blue journal, her mind reeling with each new revelation. The entries painted a picture of a young Margaret Abernathy, fresh out of college and working as a secretary at a nondescript government office in Washington, D.C. But it quickly became apparent that her job was far from ordinary. The journal spoke of clandestine meetings, coded messages, and a project so secret that even its name was never fully written out, always referred to as Operation S. As Sarah read, she began to piece together a chilling narrative. Operation S, from what she could gather, involved some kind of advanced technology, something that Mrs. Abernathy described as beyond anything the public could imagine. There were references to experiments, test subjects, and results that were both promising and terrifying. One entry, dated July 17, 1967, stood out. "Jay says we're close to a breakthrough. I overheard Dr. K talking about ethical concerns. When I asked Jay about it, he just smiled and said, 'Ethics are a luxury we can't afford in times of war.' I'm starting to wonder what I've gotten myself into." She couldn't go to the police, not when she didn't know who to trust. The men who had broken into Mrs. Abernathy's apartment were clearly still looking for the journal, which meant Sarah herself might be in danger. Dr. Cohen had been one of Sarah's professors in nursing school, a brilliant man with a background in both medicine and history. More importantly, he had a reputation for being trustworthy and discreet. Sarah dialed the number, her heart pounding as she waited for an answer. "Dr. Cohen? It's Sarah Miller. I'm sorry to call so early, but I need your help. It's an emergency." There was a pause, then Dr. Cohen's voice came through, more alert now. "Are you all right?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I can't explain everything over the phone, but I need to meet with you. Somewhere private. It's about a historical document I've come across." "I see," Dr. Cohen said slowly. "All right, Sarah. There's a coffee shop on Maple Street, the Hidden Bean. Meet me there in an hour. And Sarah? Be careful." She looked around her apartment, suddenly feeling exposed. But first, she had to hide the journal. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do for now. Grabbing a backpack, she stuffed in some clothes, her laptop, and the doctor textbook. As an afterthought, she took the framed photo of her parents from her bedside table. If she had to run, she wanted something to remind her of home. Just as she was about to leave, a knock at her door made her freeze. Making a split-second decision, she opened her window and climbed out onto the fire escape. As she descended the metal stairs as quietly as possible, she could hear Officer Chen knocking more insistently. Her feet hit the alley behind the apartment building, and Sarah took off running. She didn't know if she was doing the right thing, but she knew one thing for certain: nothing in her life would ever be the same again. What exactly was Operation S? And most importantly, where was Mrs. Abernathy now? Little did Sarah know, her quest for answers was about to lead her down a rabbit hole of government secrets, hidden agendas, and a truth so shocking it would shake the very foundations of her understanding of the world. The Hidden Bean was a small, dimly lit coffee shop tucked away on a quiet street. Her eyes scanned the room, finally landing on a familiar figure seated in a corner booth. Dr. Elias Cohen looked much as Sarah remembered him: salt and pepper hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an air of quiet intelligence. As she approached, he stood to greet her, his brow furrowing with concern. "You look like you've been through hell. What's going on?" Sarah sank into the booth, her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. She shook her head, feeling lost and overwhelmed. "I don't understand any of it, Dr. Cohen. What was Mrs. Abernathy involved in? And why is it coming back to haunt her now, after all these years? What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this table, understand?" When Sarah nodded, he continued, "In the 1960s, there were rumors in certain academic circles about a top-secret government project. Something to do with enhancing human capabilities, physically and mentally." Sarah's eyes widened. "Operation S," she breathed. Dr. Cohen nodded grimly. "That's what they called it. Most people dismissed it as conspiracy theory nonsense, but I always suspected there was more to it." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "But why now?" "It would be too valuable. Too dangerous." Sarah's mind reeled with the implications. Dr. Cohen shook his head. As the weight of the situation settled over her, Sarah felt a mix of fear and determination. "What do we do now?" she asked. Finally, he said, "We need more information. Do you have the journal with you?" As she handed it to Dr. Cohen, the bell above the coffee shop door chimed. Sarah glanced up, then felt her blood run cold. Two men in dark suits had entered the shop, their eyes scanning the room with predatory intensity. "Dr. Cohen," she whispered urgently, "we need to leave." Without a word, he slipped the textbook into his own bag and stood. "Follow me," he murmured. "Act natural." She could feel the men's eyes on her, could sense them starting to move in their direction. "I have a friend who owns this place," he explained as they hurried along. "There's a back exit." His words were cut off by the sound of the door bursting open behind them. "Stop right there!" a gruff voice commanded. Dr. Cohen grabbed Sarah's hand. Just days ago, she had been a normal nurse, leading a quiet life. As they turned a corner, Dr. Cohen suddenly stumbled, clutching his chest. "Sarah," he gasped. "I can't, my heart." The sound of footsteps was getting closer, but she couldn't leave him. Her nursing instincts took over as she lowered him to the ground, frantically checking his pulse. "Well, well," came a smooth voice from behind her. "What do we have here?" Sarah turned to see the two men from the coffee shop standing over them, their expressions cold and triumphant. She stood, placing herself between them and Dr. Cohen. "Who are you?" The man with the smooth voice smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What we want, Ms. Miller, is very simple. We want the journal." Sarah's mind raced. She needed to buy time, to figure out a way out of this situation. "I don't know where Mrs. Abernathy is," she said truthfully. "And I don't have the journal." The man's smile faded. "Don't lie to us, Ms. Miller. We know you took it from the apartment. Now you can hand it over and tell us what you know, or things can get unpleasant." As Sarah stood her ground, trying to come up with a plan, she had no way of knowing that this confrontation was just the beginning. The secrets contained in that little blue journal were about to plunge her into a world of danger, betrayal, and earth-shattering revelations that would change everything she thought she knew about the world and herself. Chapter 6: Revelations and Escapes. Sarah's mind raced as she faced the two menacing figures before her. She knew she had to act fast, but what could she do against these trained operatives? The instructor's voice echoed in her head. When faced with a stronger opponent, use their strength against them. In a move born of desperation and adrenaline, Sarah lunged forward, feinting towards the smooth-voiced man. As he moved to intercept her, she ducked low, using her momentum to drive her shoulder into his midsection. The man let out a surprised oof as he stumbled backward, colliding with his partner. In the moment of confusion that followed, Sarah spun around, hooked her arms under Dr. Cohen's, and began to drag him towards the end of the alley. Her muscles screamed with the effort, but fear and determination lent her strength she didn't know she possessed. "Stop them!" the smooth-voiced man shouted, his calm demeanor finally cracking. Sarah's heart pounded as she heard footsteps racing towards them. Just as she thought all was lost, a van screeched to a halt at the end of the alley. The side door slid open, revealing a young man with wild, curly hair. "Get in!" he yelled, jumping out to help Sarah with Dr. Cohen. Without questioning this unexpected rescue, Sarah helped haul the semi-conscious professor into the van. She leaped in after him, and the vehicle peeled away just as their pursuers reached the alley's end. As they sped through the city streets, Sarah turned to their mysterious savior. "Who are you? How did you find us?" The young man grinned, his eyes bright with excitement behind thick-rimmed glasses. "I'm a friend of Dr. Cohen's. He activated an emergency beacon when you guys left the coffee shop. Good thing, too, looks like you were in quite a pickle back there." "Dr. Cohen has an emergency beacon?" He glanced worriedly at the professor, who was now sitting up, his color improving. "For now, we need to get somewhere safe. Those guys will be looking for you." As they drove, Sarah filled Charlie in on the events of the past day. His eyes widened as she mentioned the Blue Journal and Operation S. "Holy crap," he breathed. "And it's far more serious than even I realized." He fixed Sarah with an intense gaze. "My dear, I'm afraid I haven't been entirely honest with you. My involvement in this goes far beyond academic interest." "What do you mean?" Dr. Cohen sighed heavily. "In the 1960s, before I became a professor, I worked for a division of the government that doesn't officially exist. I was part of Operation S." The van fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over them. Sarah's mind reeled, trying to reconcile the kindly professor she knew with this new information. "So you know what happened?" she asked finally. "You know what they were doing?" Dr. Cohen nodded grimly. "I was one of the lead scientists on the project. At first, it was exciting. We thought we were on the cusp of a new era for humanity." His expression darkened. "But then we started seeing the side effects. Some even died. When I voiced my concerns, I was quietly removed from the project." Charlie spoke up from the driver's seat. "So why is all this coming up now?" "I'm not sure. But if they're willing to go to these lengths, it must mean the project is active again. And if that's the case, we're all in grave danger." As the van wound its way through the city, Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of questions and fears. She had wanted to help Mrs. Abernathy, to solve a mystery. Instead, she found herself embroiled in a decades-old conspiracy that threatened not just her life, but potentially the fate of humanity itself. Charlie pulled the van into an underground parking garage. "We're here," he announced. "My place. It's not much, but it's off the grid. We should be safe here for a while." As they helped Dr. Cohen out of the van, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger, more dangerous adventure. The blue journal in her backpack felt heavier than ever, its secrets a burden she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. But as she looked at Dr. Cohen's weary face and thought of Mrs. Abernathy, still missing and in danger, Sarah knew she couldn't turn back now. Whatever the cost, whatever the danger, she was committed to seeing this through. Chapter 7: The Hidden Truth. Charlie's off-the-grid hideout turned out to be a cluttered apartment in a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. Every available surface was covered with computer equipment, stacks of books, and what looked like homemade electronic devices. "Welcome to my humble abode," Charlie said with a flourish as they entered. Her eyes scanned the apartment, taking in the organized chaos of Charlie's living space. "Charlie," Sarah asked hesitantly, "what exactly do you do?" The young man grinned, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Oh, a bit of this, a bit of that. Officially, I'm a grad student in computer science. Unofficially, let's just say I have a knack for finding information that doesn't want to be found. What Charlie means to say is that he's a hacker. One of the best I've ever encountered." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "Is that how you knew to find us?" Charlie nodded, his expression turning serious. "The doc and I have an arrangement. When he activated the emergency beacon, I knew something big was going down." Sarah sank into a nearby chair, her head spinning. "This is all so surreal," she murmured. 24 hours ago, my biggest concern was my next shift at the hospital. Now I'm hiding out with a former government scientist and a hacker, running from men in black suits." Dr. Cohen sat up slowly, wincing slightly. "But now that you're involved, you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." He held out his hand. "May I see the journal?" As she handed it to Dr. Cohen, she couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. The professor opened the journal carefully, his eyes scanning the pages with a mix of recognition and growing concern. Sarah asked, surprised. But she was also deeply compassionate. When things started to go wrong, she was one of the first to raise ethical concerns. As he continued to read, his face grew increasingly pale. "This is worse than I thought," he muttered. Dr. Cohen looked up, his eyes haunted. "Operation S didn't end when I left." "What do you mean, other realms?" The professor took a deep breath. The project leaders became convinced that by enhancing human consciousness, they could create individuals capable of perceiving, and eventually traversing, the barriers between different planes of existence. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of this revelation sank in. "Are you saying they succeeded? That they actually found a way to access other dimensions?" Dr. Cohen nodded grimly. "According to Margaret's notes, yes. But the consequences were catastrophic. Test subjects reported nightmarish visions, encounters with entities beyond human comprehension. Some went mad." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "And you think this is why Mrs. Abernathy is in danger now?" "Not just knew about it," Dr. Cohen replied, turning a page in the journal. "Her last entries speak of a plan to expose the project, to bring it all crashing down. But she also mentions a failsafe, something she put in place in case she was discovered." Charlie's eyes lit up. "A failsafe? Like what, insurance?" Dr. Cohen shook his head. "I'm not sure. The details are vague." Sarah stood up, pacing the small apartment as she tried to process this information. "So what do we do now? How do we find Mrs. Abernathy and stop these people? Find out where she went, who she contacted. And we need to locate this failsafe before they do." Charlie cracked his knuckles, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "Well, folks, it looks like it's time for me to work some magic. Give me a few hours with my babies here." He gestured to his array of computers. "And I'll see what I can dig up on our missing Mrs. Abernathy." As Charlie set to work, his fingers flying over the keyboards, Sarah found herself staring out the window at the city below. Somewhere out there, Mrs. Abernathy was hiding, possibly in grave danger. And beyond that, if what Dr. Cohen said was true, there were forces at work that defied imagination, shadowy government agencies, gateways to other dimensions, and who knew what else. She thought back to the scream that had started it all, just a day ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. Sarah knew that by choosing to stay, to see this through, she was irrevocably changing the course of her life. But as she turned back to look at Dr. Cohen, poring over the journal, and Charlie, engrossed in his digital sleuthing, Sarah felt a surge of determination. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers they might face, she was committed now. They would find Mrs. Abernathy, uncover the truth about Operation S, and put a stop to whatever nefarious plans were in motion. Little did Sarah know, the path ahead would lead her to confront not just external threats, but the very nature of reality itself, and her own unexpected role in the cosmic drama unfolding around her.
Subscribe for more.